Hello, Renegade marketers. If this is your first time, welcome. And if you're a regular listener, welcome back. You're about to listen to a career huddle where the CMO Huddles community gets exclusive access to the authors of some of the world's best selling business books. Stephen Dennis, author of Leaders Leap, joins us for a conversation about transformation at scale. Well timed for the start of 2025. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. You'll be supporting our quest to be the #1 B2B marketing podcast. All right, let's dive in. Hello, huddlers. It is an absolute pleasure to be here today with a remarkable guest, Steve Dennis, who has long been a thought leader in the realm of business strategy, leadership, and most importantly, retail. In fact, I know Steve from way back when. I know him as Mr. Retail because we met as part of an IBM Futurist program. I'm thinking 15 years ago. Steve's latest book, Leaders Leap, delves into the moments when leaders must make bold decisions to drive change, embrace innovation, and transform their organizations. And it's something we talk a lot about innovation in the course of huddles and what role CMO plays. So Steve's going to help us sort of guide through that conversation. Anyway, Steve, great to see you. I'm delighted you can join us today.
Yeah, it's great to reconnect. I think it was pretty close to 15 years ago because I was just getting started with my consulting business and speaking and all that.
Just to ground us, where are you this fine day?
I am in Dallas, Texas. I don't really have a good reason for why I'm still here, but I moved here 20 years ago from Chicago to join the Neiman Marcus Group, and I haven't left.
There you go. All right. So something was sticky. Anyway, all right. So one of the things we like to do, just in case our audience has to leave early or we need to convince them to stay, let's provide, here's, by the way, just so folks can see the book, Leaders Leap, let's provide 3 things leaders, and maybe focus on CMOs, typically get wrong when it comes to leaping or not leaping.
I did give some thought to this, and I don't know if I have the most compelling answer, but 2 of them I would say are broader, and maybe the third is a little bit more CMO
Okay.
specific. The first is what got you here isn't likely to get you where you need to go. In other words, the things that we've relied on to be successful, whether it's personally or for our particular corner of the world, relying on those is probably not going to be what's going to propel you forward. We probably talk a little bit more about why I think that, but also, in fact, relying on your very particular set of skills, as retail strategist Liam Neeson often says, may actually get in the way of what you need to do to be successful in the future.
Okay.
The second one, and this terminology I may have to explain a little bit, but a slightly better version of mediocre is not likely to be a winning strategy. In other words, if you have a product that is not remarkable, or a service, or whatever particular thing you might be doing, a slightly better version of it is not likely to be the key to your success. In fact, it might distract you from working on the things you actually need to do to leap. The third one's maybe a little vague, but what I see a lot is people say they're customer-centric, say their organization is customer-centric, and usually that's a bunch of nonsense. I'm sure everybody on this Zoom, that's not true for, but that's what I see.
Of course not. No, but that, present company accepted. But so, all right, let's go through those one at a time. What got you here, may not get you here. And again, group of CMOs, strong leaders, strong marketers, tough market right now. I mean, rising tide, lowering tide. The lowering tide has made it really, really hard for a lot of CMOs. And it probably leads into your second point about remarkable. But when you say what got you here won't get you ahead, what specifically do you have in mind?
Well, the main thing, and I'll state this at the risk of saying the obvious, but the pace of change has been incredible and is only accelerating. So the things that are likely to distinguish, the things that worked 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago are either irrelevant or becoming less and less effective. And part of which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit, but part of the motivation for the book is you look at so many brands, so many companies that were incredibly powerful, in many cases dominant 20 years ago, that are either gone or gasping for air. So I think if you just look at what's happened to many excellent companies, it just sort of stares you in the face. And if you look at what many of them did to try to address the problems in their companies, it was largely trying to do a better version of what they've done forever, not trying to really change in a profound way. So I think that's the main thing. But some of it is also just an orientation of, that cliche of, if all you got is a hammer, you keep pounding the same particular set of nails. But if the customer's moved on, or technology has moved on, or new competition has emerged, in many cases, trying to keep using those skills could actually distract you, I guess, from what you need to do.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm torn on this one because I know that certain things are universal. Being a leader, and the tenets of leadership are ones that seem to apply 20 years ago, 10 years ago. The crux of this thing, I think, is your second point about being remarkable as a company and a brand, and as an offering, and that mediocre is, as you put it, is simply not going to get you there. And that one to me is really interesting because in a lot of cases in B2B, CMO doesn't control product. And
Right.
so they're given what they're given. And yet that's the problem, right? The product isn't remarkable. So the request is make your marketing remarkable. And sometimes that can work, but remarkable
Yeah.
marketing against a mediocre product is a formula for it faster demise.
Right. Right.
Right. So talk a little
Yeah.
bit about this concept of remarkability and being remarkable, and why that is such a fundamental crux to everything in the book.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm sure many people will be familiar with Seth Godin's. Seth's been a friend of mine since the age of 19, so I've stolen or borrowed many ideas from him. But it's really what he first put forward in Purple Cow 20 plus years ago now, was this idea that in a world of abundant choice, but I think even particularly what we've seen over the last 15 or 20 years, this reduction in friction. So customers just have incredible access 24/7 to products, to services. They have an incredible amount of information about comparing features and benefits, pricing. It's so easy in many cases, not all, to go back and forth from different options. So we're just in an incredibly different world. Plus the noise and the distraction that most customers, you just think about text messaging and email and Slack messages and everything. So we're in a very noisy world where it's harder and harder to separate the signal from the noise. So if all you offer is very anodyne, or even, very good, you may not get noticed in the first place. And obviously, if you don't get noticed, there's no chance for engagement or making the sale or building loyalty or high NPS scores or what have you. So I think the bar in most industries continues to be raised. And so if you're not aiming to be truly remarkable, and I mean it in the way that Seth uses it in Purple Cow, which is both, probably the typical way we think about it, being unique, being differentiated, having a strong customer value proposition, those kinds of things, but also providing such value, and ideally a little bit harder in B2B than B2C, creating that emotional connection that causes your customers to share the story of your brand. So that's obviously the highest order in many cases of getting that virality, getting those recommendations. So, it's always been a good idea to have a unique value proposition, to be as differentiated as you can. But I think what's really different, and probably only getting harder, is the sheer noise, the choice, the lack of friction. So if we don't keep raising the bar, we're likely not to get noticed in the first place, and definitely not make the sale.
What I like about the term remarkable, and I've always sort of felt that that was such a great goal, is, the second point is, what are you doing that people will remark on,
Right.
right? What makes it worth remarking about? And so it is a great word to use. And I also think in a world where a lot of words have landmines for B2B CMOs, remarkable is a good one, because
Mhm.
that people can they have a sense of what that means in their own mind. All right. Your third point was people say they're customer centric, but they're not. What should we be thinking about in that particular context?
Well, I actually have toyed with writing a whole book about this, which I think I'm going to call "What's So Funny About Peace, Love, and Customer Centricity," because customer centricity has been around for a really long time. But if you study as other people have, and I have to a certain degree, which companies are truly customer centric. What you often see are customers that are very product centric or channel centric or customer service centric or a whole host of other things that don't really add up to having the enterprise, having deep understanding of customers' needs and wants, having actual customer insight, having a set of processes and metrics that assure that you're tracking where you want to. So I just think there's often, the number of consulting clients I've worked with where, and I'll just back up a tiny bit, but there's two questions I often ask when I'm starting to work with a company or if I'm doing a workshop or something, which is the culture wired to say yes or wired to say no, which gets to aspects of transformation and innovation, which is a different topic. But also I had try to get them to talk about where they are on customer centricity. And usually you get some sort of gobbledygook kind of answer that sounds like a lunchroom poster. But, if I start to ask any questions about, tell me about your customers, tell me about how you're doing acquiring, growing, retaining, and driving remarkability, most companies completely crap out on any semblance of a good answer. And if you don't know how you're doing and you don't know the drivers of it, then how are you going to have plans that are going to make a difference? So I think it gets a lot of lip service. It sounds great, customer obsessed, blah, blah, blah. But I just don't see a lot of companies. Again, I'm sure everybody on the call is doing a great job. But out in the wild, I think most companies are woefully inadequate in this regard.
Well, just look how money is spent. If you look at, and we're happen to be in budgeting season right now, but if you look at where the dollars are allocated, and this gets to another point, which is it's like 80% of the budget is quote in the demand gen world, 20% might be against customer research and customer service and engagement. And very little can be actually put in a bucket called brand or reputation building. So you've got everything that's about micro and nothing that's about remarkable. And so, and one of the points that Isabel Pugliese just made is, and I'm going to quote her, I would argue that the reason that brands hurt themselves is because they stop focusing on brand. I'll use the word reputation for creativity and emotion to be remarkable and over digitize the entire experience under the guise of demand gen. That's exactly sort of what I just said. And it is a battle that CMOs face because there's this, I'm going to say, alternate reality of PE and VC firms, which are not necessarily building brands to last. They are building brands to sell. They have a short-term thing. They're focused on EBITDA. They're not thinking, gee, I'm going to build a great company. I'm going to build a company that I can flip. And I just don't think that leads to great marketing or opportunities. But that's just me. Maybe others have seen a different scenario. We're total agreement on remarkable. We're talking about customer centricity. We talk a lot about in huddles about how CMOs can play an active role in customers, whether it's setting up and running the customer advisory board, whether it's setting up or being part of an executive sponsorship program where each executive owns a large customer. And of course, community building and all of those good things. So we talk a lot about that. It is a hard thing for CMOs to get budgeting for when the emphasis is on demand gen. All right.
Sure.
So, which kind of gets into this other issue, which you and I were talking about before we started, which is, all right, a CMO is not going to argue with you. They want to put a remarkable product in the marketplace. They want to build a remarkable brand. And they have to sell that to the CEO. And honestly, there are very few examples in B2B of remarkable brands. The only ones that are remarkable are sort of the B2B to C, whether, and those are the ones who sort of, actually do interesting work. So what's your advice to CMOs in terms of getting the CEO and the board to understand why being remarkable across the board is so fundamental to being successful?
I'll be a little bit of a politician and dodge the question a little bit. I do think it's a huge challenge. This book is much more pointed, I would say, at kind of whoever's setting overall business strategy, which is typically the CEO and maybe a couple of other people. But what I try to get at is what I would call both the left brain and right brain approach to this problem. So on the left brain side, I would say you definitely want to bring as many facts to bear as you possibly can. And I think you can do that if you're a CMO or anybody kind of in the C-suite from a pretty bottoms up way, which is as much kind of state of the customer facts as you can bring, external environment, probably a lot of things that everybody is doing. So I don't know that I've got anything really breakthrough there in terms of how to tell those stories. But I think another way to tell the story is to make some broader comments about, and I'm sure some people are doing this, but what is really going on with the pace of change on the part of customers? What's really going on in the external environment? What's really going on with technology? And I think and this gets a little bit to the right brain, which is people aren't afraid enough. And I hate to use fear as a motivation, but one of the quotes I have in the book is from Len Goodman from Dancing with the Stars, which is, it's never too early to panic. And I'm not, I don't love being so fear-based in the approach here. But another quote from Miles Davis is, if you're not nervous, you're not paying attention. When you see and this is part of what I try to set up in the beginning, when you see, and I'll just use my retail example, but how many retailers have failed or are failing? When you see the massive shift in market value, I'll just give a stat, which I hope some people can relate to. If you look at, so I started my career at Sears in the department store industry in the 90s, been gone from there quite a long time. Also worked at Neiman Marcus. So I spent a lot of time in the department store industry earlier in my career. If you look at the top 5 department stores in the US, first of all, they have lost about 80% of their revenue over the last 20 years. And so, this is the Macy's, this is Sears, JCPenney, iconic brands have lost 80% of their sales and something like 95% of their market value. At the same time, you can look at a company like Ulta. People might be familiar. It's a off-the-mall specialty cosmetics brand. Ulta is only in product categories that represent about 10% of the department store mix. Ulta is more valuable, quite easily actually, than all 5 department stores. So even though they're only in one category, they've accumulated tens of billions of dollars in market value, while these 5 incredibly famous brands have lost it. So, we see this happening in industry after industry. So this disruption is real. It's often accelerating. Not everybody, the subtitle of the book is Transforming Your Company at the Speed of Disruption, which kind of begs the question, what is the speed of disruption? And that definitely varies quite a lot by industry. So I'm not suggesting every industry needs some sort of massive reinvention in the next 3 years or they're going to be gone. But you don't have to look very far, whether it's the advent of e-commerce and distribution changes, whether it's cloud computing, smart devices, social media. You just go down the line of massive shifts that are only picking up. So I think you can use, that's a very long answer, I'm sorry, but I think you could start a little bit of what, and I suggest some questions in the book to help people frame this, but what forces could radically shift the playing field over the next several years? Do you really understand them? Do you understand what's coming? Are you doing enough? And the doing enough might be standing up more proof of concepts, right? It might be, a relatively modest experimentation program, but it might be more profound. But if you aren't talking about it and you're not kind of breaking through your denial and you aren't feeling a little bit nervous, then you got a great job because your company's not changing very much, and you can just keep collecting the cash and retire happily in 20 or 30 years. But that's not generally the case throughout most industries.
There's a couple things that came up here. One, I just want to make so the CMO CEO relationship, in this ideal world, we did a lunch huddle in London, and a couple of the CEOs and the CMO present there talked about how they love it when their CMO is their strategy person, the sort of deputy CEO. I love that aspiration. I'm not sure that it's going to work everywhere for every CMO. But being able to be really close to strategy obviously is important to the CMO. In one way or another, they have to be able to touch it because that's what's going to determine what they have to market. But the other, and then the next point you talked about Alta's function. In your book, you mentioned also Trader Joe's. And I think that's in the third leap, which is special, not big.
Right.
And I think this is a really important one. I talk about my book, and I think it's chapter 1, Focus is Your Friend, or something like that. But
yeah,
the quote that I have is, trying to go after everyone can amount to going after no one. I underline that. But this is something that CMOs are being told, hey, grow the business 25% next year. And so that doesn't reconcile with being special, not big. Talk a little bit about how being special doesn't mean you can't grow. It just...
right. Yeah. Well, I think, and I'll try to be, and I'm happy to answer any questions about this to the extent I can. But one of the things we've seen broadly, certainly in retail, but in many other sectors, is what I've been referring to for a while is the collapse of the middle. And by that, I don't mean there aren't price points across the spectrum or kind of good, better, best, but we've tended to see models that are very much focused on value and convenience, scale and scope. So in the retail environment, Walmart, Amazon, Costco, et cetera. Or you see more kind of specialty versions where you pick a narrower, focus is your friend. Like you focus on a set of customers and you try to meet their needs in a more impactful way. And generally speaking, these are premium price products. But being in between, it has been increasingly untenable in a lot of sectors because you're not the fastest, you're not the most convenient, and trying to become, out Walmart, out Amazon, out Granger, whatever, out IBM is often a fool's errand because the businesses have become so scale scope based, and you just can't invest the dollars to keep up. And just to quote Seth again, you may just end up in a race to the bottom. And the problem is with the race to the bottom is you might win or worse finish second. So I think it's very important to really not get stuck in this middle ground, but really pick a lane. And for most companies and most leaders, if you don't work at Amazon or Walmart or one of the, humongous scale companies, Microsoft, something, is to try to find not necessarily a niche in that it has to be really small, but try to find a set of customers and meet those needs more profoundly and hopefully in a way that takes you away from competing all on price or competing on this massive scale or incredible convenience. So I like the special, not big kind of idea. I like the idea of going narrow and deep. Of one of the things I talk about, which is taken from Nike, is this idea of editing to amplify. Can you eliminate some of the customers perhaps that don't have any potential for loyalty and profitability, or can you simplify your product line or your service line? Can you add things to just be that much more powerful?
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned Nike. They got rid of a bunch of retailers they were distributing, and the sales went up as they focused on their experiences and controlling experience. I did a podcast with the CMO of SADA. They used to be cloud support for everybody. They decided to be only Google Cloud. Their business doubled. So there are really good examples of that. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. This show is brought to you by CMO Huddles, the only marketing community dedicated to B2B greatness and that donates 1% of revenue to the Global Penguin Society. Why? Well, it turns out that B2B CMOs and penguins have a lot in common. Both are highly curious and remarkable problem solvers. Both prevail in harsh environments by working together with peers, and both are remarkably mediagenic. And just as a group of penguins is called a huddle, our community of over 300 B2B marketing leaders huddle together to gain confidence, colleagues, and coverage. If you're a B2B CMO, why not dive into CMO Huddles by registering for our free starter program on cmohuddles.com. Hope to see you in a huddle soon. We had a couple questions sort of going back to this notion of customer centricity. Are you sort of tracking any companies that are particularly customer centric and how they do it at scale? Thanks for that question, EJ.
Well, it's probably an overly used example, but I think, Amazon is actually really good at this. And they do talk about, their customer obsession. They're in a good position because they have just, as probably everybody would know, just so much data and so many touch points and flywheels. So it's hard maybe to learn anything from them because it's so hard to replicate. I'm working with one retailer. Unfortunately, it's confidential, but I can tell you some of the things. I mean, they've really built out, and you touched on some of these things, but they've really gone deep on customer segmentation. They've really gone deep on customer journey mapping, much more a suite of customer metrics. Part of their strategy, customer strategy, is really anchored on having kind of visualize a matrix, because I never met a matrix I didn't like, of customer segments down one side, and then across are, how they're doing on acquisition growth, which is both frequency and a number of items per transaction, those sorts of things, retention and NPS. And their customer insight map is really trying to, they can't do everything. And I very much take the point that it's hard to fund. You have this like ideal list of things that you'd love to do, and it's very hard to get to all of them, but they've prioritized and they've helped the entire leadership team understand through this kind of simple visual and just being able to click down onto certain aspects how these customer metrics tie to sales and profits and ultimately market their publicly traded company. I wouldn't say they've got that exactly worked out, but they've been working with some outside consultants on that customer evaluation tie. So, I mean, I think it's a good suite, but it's taking both a framework for thinking about customer growth, kind of picking out the pieces, saying to ourselves, how well do we understand this? Do we really know what's going on? What are the drivers? And then standing up ways to try to get, either better hypotheses about it or some actual data to inform their strategies, which ultimately ties to, branding and ties to media plans and all that good stuff.
Interesting. As you talked about Amazon, I'm actually listening to a book right now called The Collision of Power, Trump, Bezos, and the Washington Post. And it's by the editor of the Washington Post as Bezos became the owner. And what was fascinating is he explains in detail how Bezos brings this customer-centric mindset to the Washington Post. And it's like he didn't want to talk to the advertising people, only wants to talk to the editors and the people responsible for putting information in front of quote customers. And so
Right.
it's probably a better case history than Amazon in terms of understanding how he thinks about it and what it looks like and how that transformation, I mean, for several years, you talk about if retail is dead, talk about print and that challenge.
Yeah.
It's really, they're parallel and painful. But at least for a certain period of time, it was transformative for the Post. And I can't speak to their current results, but anyway, that it offers some surprising lessons on customer centricity in the industry. Okay, so that was one. I want to go and let's see. We've got one other thing about customers and customer centricity, which is tricky in B2B. Look, in B2C, it's like I go to Ulta, I buy my my face makeup, whatever it is. And it's a one to brand individual. But we've got cases where we've got a buying group, we've got an individual department that may want to use the tool, we've got end users, we've got probably anywhere from 10 to 15 different people. So defining customer is really hard in that context. So, and I'm just making the point that that's a challenge of B2B. I don't know if you have a response to that.
Well, yeah, yes and no. So I actually did run a B2B division of a company, about $800 million business earlier in my career. So I do have some experience, though not super recent. I mean, to me, the thing about B2B, there's a lot of leakage in B2C businesses in terms of really understanding customer data. I happen to work at Neiman Marcus, where it was more like a B2B business because we tended to have a fewer number of customers that were very important to us, and we could talk to them and we can understand their needs more specifically. Then we had a bunch of people that were anonymous. B2C in some ways is easier to understand, but you also don't have nearly the opportunity to have as much insight as is often possible in B2B. So, I think you just have to avail yourself. It's probably more conversational in many cases than, massive data sets. And so you have to develop, if you don't have it, good listening skills and good, different kinds of ways to segment customers perhaps than would be more typical in a CPG or retail sort of world. But the thing that has always struck me, and I do work with a number of B2B, mostly retail technology kind of companies. I do work with a lot of B2B companies. I think the thing is that, and maybe it's obvious, but when you think about lifetime value, when you're in B2C kind of businesses, you got a lot of customers and very few of them represent a tremendous amount of lifetime value. Oftentimes in B2B, you got fewer customers that have that potential. So I think part of the way I would think about it, and I say this with my B2B is, it's actually more worthwhile in some respects to invest in customer insight and to be playing around with different proofs of concepts, because if you can get it right, you've got the potential to lock in a customer and do a land and expand kind of thing. So, but I know there's a lot of different kinds of B2B businesses, so I don't want to
Yeah, no,
generalize
it's
too
and
too
all
much
those
on
points,
that point.
all those points are good. I want to step back because I think there was a point we leapt over mind leap number 2,
Yeah.
which is wake up. And I think this is really important and really relevant right now. And at the end of that chapter, you asked a series of questions, including what percentage of your time and other resources are invested in learning about and exploring nascent or emerging trends that may have an impact beyond a 3-year horizon. I don't know what the answer is among this group, but I suspect given all the things that they're trying to do, it's probably fairly low. Where there's a will, there's a way, but these are time-constrained individuals. How do leapers find the time to do this? And is this an everyday thing or is this a planning thing?
Well, there's a couple ways I think about this. I mean, first of all, and I admit this is hard to do, but part of what I try to point to with the book, and we've talked on a little bit, is creating this paranoia, and some of that is around, frankly, you might get blindsided, you might get leapt over in a way that you cannot recover from, and I try to make that argument to a certain degree by just pointing out to people, because I think we all sort of know it. In fact, I did a speech on the book a little while back where I started, and I don't actually have this phrase in the book, but I started out saying that this question, because this is true, even though it's not exactly in the book, the thing that has been gnawing at me when I work with clients or I write or speak is, and when I see companies that are struggling to transform for this new era, is if the world has changed so much, why have you changed so little? And everybody will agree pretty much that the world, I mean, maybe their little corner of the world hasn't changed that much. I always use my dry cleaner as an example. Like I go to the dry cleaner. I don't know that her world has changed that much. Seems like a pretty stable business. But, you're out in the wild here. Most businesses have seen just these massive changes over the last few years. And, if you just think about AI, a lot that's changing and is going to change quite a bit. So, everybody goes, yeah, oh my God, the world's changing so much. It's volatile, it's complex. Who knows what's going to happen? Macro worlds, but also technology, competition, customers, et cetera. But most people aren't, having changed so much. So you have to create that tension, or I try to create that tension, so that hopefully gets you to the point of saying, well, if all I'm doing is looking at a 1 or 2 year time horizon from a planning perspective, or I'm only defining my competitive set, in the way I've always defined it, are there things that are happening or could happen that could really change things? So I'll use just some examples that people will probably be familiar with. If you were in the taxi business and you were focused on the definition of the taxi business as it's been historically constructed, or you were in the hotel business and you focused on it in the way that it was historically constructed, you totally missed Airbnb and Uber that solved the customer's problem, essentially the same problem, but a completely different way that has completely changed the way your business is. So I'm not saying everybody, actually, we just, on my podcast, the Remarkable Retail podcast, we had the former head of transformation from Nike talking about, he believes that companies need to be spending 50% on optimizing their current business model and 50% on new stuff. I don't know. I mean, it's provocative. And I think some companies that's probably true for. I don't know that I would go that far. But you have to decide for yourself, if you're spending 99.9% of your time optimizing your current business model, do you really believe that that is the right call? That's what many companies are doing. So I'm not saying, it's got to be 50-50,
Right.
but it's probably got to be more than you're currently doing. So, ways of doing that are everything from creating an R&D budget, creating departments and processes that are focused on things that may not generate significant EBITDA for 5 years. I mean, there's a lot of different ways of doing it. When I was working with Nike a long time ago now, one of the things they did was they basically took 2 weeks every year to focus exclusively on the future with the leadership team, and then some stuff along the way. But they basically said, clear your calendars. We're going out around the world to see innovation and meet with people that are going to challenge our thinking. So there's lots of different ways. But again, the point is you're almost certainly not doing enough. But I realize it's hard. I mean, I've been the head of strategy at two Fortune 500 companies, and every day struggled with getting leadership to, I worked for the CEO. In one case, I ran the executive leadership team meeting. So it's not like I didn't have a seat at the table. I mean, I think I have some more knowledge today than I know I have more knowledge today than I had when I was sitting in those chairs, but it's not trivial. So I don't have any like pithy way of describing it. But I think the more you can create a sense of urgency and panic, honestly, in some cases, then just decide to start moving in the direction of more experimentation and opening the aperture to look at things that could come from the outside to really change things.
So there's a through line here of things that we've been talking about that I just want to posit, which is I think every CMO, certainly that I engage with, wants to be remarkable at their job, to be associated with, if not build, a remarkable brand slash company. In order to do that, they may be lucky in that the remarkableness is already there, but let's assume it isn't, because in most B2B companies, it isn't. They have the opportunity to, and I'm going to say drive strategy, but to be an impact player, to use Liz Weissman's term, they don't have to be the person sitting in the strategic seat, but they can be the sort of orchestrator and behind the scenes pushing and enabling. And
Right.
one of the things that I like about your book is that you help sort of create a path and a way for, and I think a CMO who read the book would think about, this equips me to help move the conversation forward. So
Mhm.
anyway, I wanted to add that little editorial bit.
Sure.
And there's one other that I wanted to get to, which is, let's see. Oh, this is a good one. Safe is risky. And
Yeah.
this is, I love this, but explain it and let's talk about it in the context of marketing.
Well, this is really, in some respects, it's the core premise of the book that, our conservatism, our reluctance to leap, both personally as well as from a business strategy standpoint, some of the things we do is ultimately the thing that's going to put us into the zone of irrelevance. But I'm trying to get at is really to rethink our relationship to risk. And I think a lot of people know this at their core. But when you look at how we spend most of our time, the slightly better version of mediocre I talked about, it's a lot about polishing, making a little bit better what we already do. And I think if you just stop to think about it for a second, if the world, and I got a little bit of a graphic in the book to try to illustrate this, but I'll kind of pantomime it here. But if you buy in first to this idea of remarkability and that the bar for performance continues to be raised, and so you have to leap higher in the value you provide. If that's the world you're living in, or you soon think you'll be living in, and the pace of change is accelerating, if you don't aim higher and move faster, you're actually falling behind. And so this incrementalism, what I refer to as kind of infinite incrementalism, which is so characteristic of a lot of companies, that you're just constantly trying to optimize. If that's your primary thing, now, by the way, as a caveat, you have to do that. Like I'm not at all suggesting stop everything, create some bold new strategy, and just throw everything in that direction. Your mileage may vary. People find themselves in difficult situations. But if you are in a world where it's getting harder and harder to be the signal amid the noise, and you are seeing the pace of change accelerate, if you're moving at this more linear pace, you in fact are falling further behind. And the odds that is raising, potentially causing an existential crisis become ever higher. So part of, and this is hopefully what gets people, the leadership team to say, what, we have to spend more time on the long term. We have to spend more time on riskier things, because if we don't, we are actually putting ourselves in a more risky situation. But this is, you know, and I would recommend Stephen Pressfield's work on fighting resistance. If people are familiar with, he's not a business strategy guy, he's a writer, but he talks a lot about how hard it is for us to confront the dragon of fear and how difficult it is to put ourselves out there. So I think that's part of the human condition. So I don't pretend this is easy. I say in the close of the book that when I was writing the book, despite my giving all this advice about safe being risky and all these leaps people need to make, I often myself wasn't doing that. And so I think it is hard to do, but it's impossible to do if you don't sign up for the challenge, if you're not willing to be more courageous in your leadership. So yeah, I think it's quite obvious that safe has been very risky for lots of these companies that we've seen fail. What I'm trying to do is to say, you know, don't be the Sears, don't be the Blockbuster, don't be the BlackBerry, don't be all these companies that were once fantastic companies, but because they couldn't see the future and mostly watch the last 20 years happen to them, they are either gone or on their way to being gone.
Well, and yeah, and you know, you mentioned Netflix, and that's a great case of a company that reinvented itself twice, and no doubt will continue to do so, having seen their initial industry disappear. One of the terms I just have to you had a subhead, which was the Confederacy of Meh. And that's not the place you want to be, folks. That is not it.
Exactly
And
right.
you get there by avoiding risk. So
Right.
let's go to the last leap. And this one I struggle with because I understand it potentially. And we had, I mean, I know Jay Baer would bring, you know, time to win. He talks about go, go, go and speed. But so your chapter is go
Yeah.
faster, go, go, go. And
Right.
it will resonate a lot with new CMOs who feel the pressure to show results quickly. But how do you reconcile the need to move fast and the need to drive transformation? I mean, transformation is not something that happens day 1, day 2, day 30.
Right. Yeah.
So where's the go faster and the plan smartly and change in a significant way? Because all the quick changes are often cosmetic.
Well, I think the first thing is, you know, in my book, I talk about these mind leaps. I think the leap here is to understand that speed is increasingly important in what we do. And that's just because the world is moving so fast and in many cases moving faster and faster. So some of that is just seeing that as the reality and trying to navigate in that direction. What I try to do in the chapter is point out some ways to make that happen. I mean, you definitely oftentimes have to go slow to go fast. So I think there are definitely times where careful study, testing, et cetera, are very smart to position you to step on the gas when it becomes more clear that something's working. Another key thing, and this is one thing, and this book is not innovation process book. I mean, I touch on some of those things, but there's plenty of good books on this. But I think one of the key things to focus on or to understand is companies that consistently innovate and that are actually transforming for the future. It is not the case that they have come up with some magical process to innovate. The most distinguishing characteristic of companies that consistently innovate is they try more stuff, you know, more swings at the bat, or pick your tired sports cliche, right? But they try more stuff and they sort through the stuff they try fast. So, you know, this is the fail fast sort of idea. And so, you know, kill your darlings, you know, take what you can glean from a proof of concept or a pilot or whatever and reshape it. But, you know, it's working through. And one of the company that I mentioned that I can't tell who they are, you know, they've really done a good job of standing up way more proof of concepts and pilots, but they've also really cycled through them very quickly. They, you know, this idea that winners never quit, that's nonsense. Quitting is underrated. There's lots of things you should quit. And the reason is because it opens you up to do other stuff, because capacity is limited. So I think there are some things that I try to tease out in the chapter to accelerate, but I would say trying more things, adopting a culture of experimentation. I alluded to this wired to say yes versus wired to say no attitude, I think are very important. But you also, to our earlier conversation, you have to make sure you appropriately resource whatever these experimentations look like? Because otherwise they're just random experiments. They're not something that's really a program of sustained innovation.
Right. And so it's interesting because I talk about this in my book about the last chapter is, trying to get 10% of your marketing dollars into things that are experiments that are not
Mhm.
things that could become big bets that are small bets
Right.
now, I think is important to it. I'm going back to that book that I'm listening to right now about Bezos and the Washington Post and how he would throw out a bunch of ideas at these folks and they say, oh, that's stupid and that's stupid. And they would respond to it. But and his point was, I know, but I'm hoping that you'll come up with a better one and we'll come up with it fast. And so that was sort of
Right.
an interesting insight into him. Again, that book is Collision of Power, and it's not a marketing book, but it's a fascinating case history on
Mm.
transformation and an inside look at it that you often don't get. All right. So what advice would you give to CMOs about, this you could be pulling your hair out because I mean, Gen AI alone, keeping up with Gen AI is really, really hard. But that's one of those transformations that feels like it's going really slow in some ways, but it's going to be all of a sudden that everything that you do is going to
Right.
be impacted by it. So what is your advice to CMOs when it comes to just managing that and then the same sense of not working 24 hours a day to try to keep up?
Right.
Balance, if there is
Well,
such a
yeah.
thing.
Yeah. Well, again, I wish I had some really compelling, pithy advice on this because I think it's a challenge. I mean, I struggle, particularly since I try to cover a really wide range of topics to stay on top of things and feel like I'm not just an inch deep. So I don't think it's easy. I mean, the kind of obvious things are what can you give up that's not really helping, or do less of. I mean, I've been able to unlock some time by looking hard at that. But also, how do you get leverage? Are there people that you need to be speaking with that are sources of inspiration or can help you work through these topics? Get creative about kind of short burst things or low intensity things that are keeping you up to date and sharp on some of these topics. But there's going to be a point where, and Gen AI is a good example. I've got one client now that is doing some experimentation, which I think is appropriate, and it's quite low level. They're getting some encouraging results, but there's going to be probably a time where they need to 10x that effort, maybe more, and they don't necessarily have the dollars or the people to do it. So, I mean, I understand that this is a real issue. I wish I had more more of an unlock there other than just keep perspective, try to look at the balance, force yourself as best you can. I mean, I look at it frankly like getting in physical shape. Like when I decided I wanted to be in better shape, then I just said, my priority is to work out before I do a bunch of other things. And there are lots of times where I'm like, oh crap, I got to get this, I've got all these emails, or I got to get this project done where I didn't do it. But longer term, that's been a good decision. But yeah, it's hard to do it. But
Yeah.
if you don't force yourself, for lack of a better term, to devote a certain amount of energy to it and schedule it, and that's why I like the Nike. I mean, I'm not specifically recommending this for every company, but the fact that in this one division, they take 2 weeks every year that is about the future, and they're going to do it together, and that time is blocked off. It's a forcing mechanism. So I'm a big fan for forcing mechanisms to try to force you to do things that are not necessarily urgent but are important.
Great stuff. And of course, one of my answers would be, well, be an active member of the CMO Huddles community where we can.
That's right. Well, that goes without saying,
Of
Jordan.
course, it goes without saying. All right. Finally, offer 2 do's and 1 don't for every CMO and things that you want them to take away from Leaders Lead.
Oh gosh. I mean, this is so high level maybe, but be willing to explore the perimeters of your ignorance. This is the term I use in the book, but what are those things? What are your edges? What are those things that you either are afraid to go explore around, talking about your job? This may be useful in your personal life as well, but I'm not going to give any unlicensed psychological advice. But go into the places that scare you. What are those things where you're uncomfortable, and wade in some ways, whether that's going to a conference or bringing a couple people in or getting your team to talk about it. I mean, depends on what the topic is. So exploring perimeters of your ignorance would be one. And I guess related to that is do a few things that scare you. What experiments could you stand up? What conversations could you have with your team or your boss or whatever, where you are more vulnerable and you expose those places? I mean, I know that's a hard thing to say in certain cultures, or just, however you happen to be wired. But I've just found when I take on uncomfortable topics with, I mean, this is true of friends, my girlfriend, whatever, but in the business world, that there's often some really great stuff there. The don't would be, don't overinvest in incrementality in your product or service offering. It's probably going to be unproductive time or diminishing returns.
I love it. Well, thank you, Steve Dennis, author
Sure. Thanks
of
for inviting me.
Leaders Leap. Where can listeners find you?
I'm always doing the shameless self promotion on LinkedIn and other places, but my website is Stephen with a V, E as in Peter Dennis, StephenPDennis.com. And I'm on LinkedIn and all over the social media.
All righty. Well, thank you all for sticking around for this conversation. I'm Drew Neisser, your host of Renegade Marketers Unite. Peace out. If you're a B2B CMO and you want to hear more conversations like this one, find out if you qualify to join our community of sharing, caring, and daring CMOs at CMOhuddles.com. Renegade Marketers Unite is written and directed by Drew Neisser. Hey, that's me. This show is produced by Melissa Caffrey, Laura Parkin, and Ishar Cuevas. The music is by the amazing Burns Twins, and the intro voiceover is Linda Cornelius. To find the transcripts of all episodes, suggest future guests, and learn more about CMO Huddles or my CMO coaching service, please visit renegademarketing.com. I'm your host, Drew Neisser. Until next time, keep those renegade marketing caps on and strong.